Hello everybody, this is lesson 10 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slides 185 to 210 of chapter 1 International Trade. In this lesson we will analyze the criticism from the anti-globalization movement against the free trade doctrine. The anti-globalization movement became noticed by the larger public for the first time at the 1999 World Trade Organization conference in Seattle. The critic of international trade concerns mainly the following points. First, workers in developing countries receive much more wages for the same work than workers in developed countries. This is caused by multinational firms which exploit the immobility of workers in developing countries. Second criticism. In a similar way, lower environmental protection standards in the developing countries are exploited. And third criticism. Globalization leads to a destruction of regional cultures by a uniform commercial culture. In the following, these arguments are discussed. We start with the effect of international trade on wages. How does international trade affect the wage level? To measure the impact of international trade on wages, one has to compare wages under a regime of free international trade with wages without free trade. A comparison of wages between developing and developed countries under free trade does not reveal the impact of free trade on wages. In case of free trade, developing countries primarily export goods whose production depend on production factors that are relatively abundant in developing countries. We have called this specialization in comparative advantages. Additional exports caused by free trade increase therefore the demand for low-skilled workers, which are relatively abundant in developing countries, such that their wages rise compared to the situation under autarky. At least this is what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem tells us. In developed countries, the opposite is the case. Wages for low-skilled workers are declining and wages for high-skilled workers are rising. We have discussed this mechanism when we discussed the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. Thus, even so, wages of low-skilled workers in developing countries are lower than the wages of low-skilled workers in developed countries. The difference between the wage levels of low-skilled workers in developing countries and developed countries would be even higher without free international trade. As a consequence, low-skilled workers, which are the majority of workers in developing countries, are winners of free trade. Only the difference between wage levels of high-skilled workers in developing countries and developed countries would be smaller without free trade. So only high-skilled workers, which are the minority of all workers in developing countries, are therefore loser of international trade. To demonstrate the effect of free trade on the wage levels of a developing country graphically, these diagrams show in a stylized way the goods market, the markets here in the first row, and the labor markets, the markets here in the second row of the low-tech sector. Here the diagrams in the first column, and the high-tech sector, the diagrams here in the second column of a typical developing country. In the low-tech sector, a developing country has typically a high supply of low-skilled workers, such that the labor supply curve lies relatively far to the right. As a result of this high supply with low-skilled workers, under autarky, the wages of low-skilled workers are relatively low. Given these low wage level, production costs are low, such that the supply of low-tech goods is relatively high. So the supply curve on the market for low-tech goods lies relatively far to the right. As a result, the price for low-tech goods under autarky is relatively low. So this price level here on the low-tech sector market is relatively low. In the high-tech sector, a developing country has typically a low supply of high-skilled workers, such that the labor supply curve of our high-skilled workers lies relatively far to the left, and as a result, the autarky wage rate in the high-tech sector is relatively high. Given this high wage level, production costs in the high-tech sector are relatively high, such that the supply of high-tech goods is relatively low. So the supply curve on the market for high-tech goods lies relatively far to the left, such that supply for a given price is always relatively low. As a consequence of this low supply of high-tech goods, the autarky prices of high-tech goods in developing countries are relatively high. This is the initial situation before the introduction of international trade. To summarize, we have high supply of labor in the low-tech sector, so the autarky wages on the labor market in the low-tech sector are low. As a result, production costs are low, so we have a high supply on the goods market in the low-tech sector, such that the autarky prices are relatively low. To the contrary, in the high-tech sector, we have a relatively small supply on the labor market, such that the autarky wage level is relatively high, and these high wages cause high production costs, such that the supply of goods in the high-tech sector is relatively small, and the autarky prices are relatively high. If we introduce now free trade and assume for simplicity the case of a small country, such that the world market price is not changed by the demand or supply of this country, the following happens with the wage rates. In the low-tech sector, the world market price is higher than the autarky price. As a result, under free international trade, domestic consumption falls to this level, while domestic production grows to this level. The difference between domestic production and consumption is exported. This has consequences for the labor market. The increased production for the low-tax sector goods causes a higher demand for low-skilled workers on the labor market of the low-tax sector. So, labor demand on the low-tax sector grows. As a result, the wages for low-skilled workers are higher after the introduction of international trade as under autarky. This is the effect of international trade on the wages of low-skilled workers in a developing country. In the high-tech sector, of course, the opposite happens. The world market price here is lower as the autarky price, such that domestic demand for high-tech goods grows and domestic production of high-tech goods falls. The difference between domestic consumption and production is now imported. This has again consequences for the labor market of high-skilled workers, the so-called high-tech sector labor market. The decreased domestic production for high-tech goods causes a lower demand for high-skilled workers. As a result, the labor demand curve for high-skilled workers moves to the left. Consequence of this is now a lower wage rate on the market for high-skilled workers. So the wage rate on the market for high-skilled workers falls under free trade compared to the wage rate under autarky. To sum up, high-tech sector wages for high-skilled workers fall because of free trade in the developing countries. However, the majority of workers in developing countries are low-skilled workers, and their wages grow because of the introduction of free trade. So this economic theory tells us that free trade causes on average higher wages in developing countries, because the wages for the majority of all workers get larger. From an empirical point of view, there is also a lot of evidence that developing countries typically start with low wages when they open for free international trade. But then increased exports cause above average growth in real wages over the course of time. This results in a catch-up process. This is revealed by the following graphs. First, for the East Asian tiger states, and then for the East European transformation countries. This diagram shows the hourly average wages measured in dollar in the year 1975 for the East Asian tiger states and a group of developed countries. Clearly, hourly wages in the tiger states had been typically much lower than the wages for the developed countries. The country with the lowest hourly wage rate in the year 1975 had been South Korea. This diagram compares the development of the real wages since the year 1975 for the Tiger States with Germany, the black line here below. It is obvious that the increase of the real wages of the Tiger States, especially for South Korea, the red line here, has grown much faster than the real wage rate of Germany. Hence, the wage gap between the Tiger States and Germany has become smaller. This is called a catch-up process. This diagram shows a likely explanation. On average of the years 1975 to 2009, the Tiger States, the green points here, had much higher investment shares in GDP than these industrialized countries, the red points here. As will be seen in the next chapter, higher investment causes higher GDP growth, and this allows to pay higher wages. When the East European countries opened their economies as the Soviet Union broke up, they made a similar experience as the Southeast Asian Tiger States. This diagram shows the average hourly wages measured in dollar in the year 1995 for a couple of East European countries and developed Western countries. Clearly, the wages of East European countries in 1995 had been much lower than the wages of developed countries. The country with the lowest hourly wage rate in the year 1975 had been Romania. This diagram compares the development of the real wages since the year 1995 for these East European countries with Germany. Germany is again represented by this black line here. This is Germany. Again, it is obvious that the increase of the real wages of these East European countries had grown much faster than the real wage of Germany. Hence, the wage gap between East European countries and Germany had become smaller. So the East European countries also experienced a catch-up process of their wages. This diagram shows, on average of the years 1995 to the year 2009, the East European countries had a much higher share of gross investment in GDP, measured on this axis, as for example Germany or the average European Union. So, higher investment is again a likely explanation for the catch-up process of these East European countries. The second point of the globalization critic argued that free trade exploits lower environmental protection standards in the developing countries. How does international trade indeed affect the environment? In most developing countries, the environment is a relatively abundant production factor, which is on one hand caused by its natural availability, but on the other hand also by a lack of environmental protection legislation. Due to this abundant supply, a transition to free trade causes typically an increased usage of environmental production factors, like air and water for intake of pollutants, forests for timber or agricultural production. If environmental protection laws, which charge polluters for the costs of environmental damage, are missing, the usage of the environment as a production factor is inefficient. Since free trade increases the incentives for production, these inefficiencies are likely to grow further in transition to free trade. Here, once again, the question arises whether a causal therapy or a symptom therapy should be applied. Should the free trade be restricted or the environmental protection laws be improved? It is also possible to argue that developing countries have the right to make more use of their relatively abundant environmental production factors in order to generate higher incomes. Many developed countries, too, have done so in their history. This example demonstrates the problem of environmental protection in developing countries. Recycling of disused ocean liners is not profitable under the environmental protection laws of, say, Europe. Most of these ships are therefore scrapped in developing countries like India, Bangladesh, or the Ivory Coast. In Alang, on the west coast of India, lies a beach of about 6 km length, on which such ships are wrecked. The chemicals released during the scrapping flow untreated into the sea or poison the beach. The working conditions are very poor as measured by European standards. In the year 1998, Greenpeace and other anti-globalization groups launched a campaign against Alang's fracking facilities. This campaign, however, was not very popular, not only among the Indian scrapping companies, but also among their workers and the local population in Alang. Despite the local pollution and the poor working conditions, workers on Alang's shipyard have an above average income as measured by Indian conditions. Furthermore, a lot of other companies in the region rely on the supply of sheep scrapped from the beaches of Alang. This example demonstrates the dilemma between environmental protection and income growth in many developing countries. Another point of criticism of the anti-globalization movement against international trade is concerned with the effect of international trade on culture. From a historical point of view, free trade has always caused more homogeneous cultural spaces. In this way, not only goods and production technologies spread, but also art styles, religious ideas became more similar. This interpenetration of cultures through trade may have been a disadvantage in terms of a loss of cultural diversity. However, if people voluntarily decide to adopt new production technologies, art styles, religious ideas from other cultures, one can also ask whether it would be justified to limit this individual freedom by trade restrictions. Okay, so much for this lecture. In the next lecture, we will take a closer look on the work of the World Trade Organization.